And so here's how this kind of fits into what we call the flow of funds. Right now you've got an operating loss, and then we add back depreciation, your non-operating revenues, and we come up with your net pledged revenues, which are $3.4 million. Then the first thing that gets paid from that money is your revenue bond debt service. And you can see that would go from $1.5 million to about $833,000 by refinancing the 2004 bonds. Then you've got the general obligation revenue bond. That's the 2008 and 2011 debt service. That number doesn't change. We're not affecting any of those bonds. And so then you can see the remaining revenues go up, again, because we've moved the debt service out. You've got the other revenues, which again I think primarily is sales tax, but there's other things that flow into that, which brings you to your total available revenues to make the payments on these refunding bonds, which would be approximately $550,000, $560,000 a year. And so again, all we're doing is we're moving the payment from this revenue bond line down here, which means we don't have to have the 1.25 times coverage on it. We don't have to have a reserve fund on it. And those are better for you in terms of looking at rates. The one thing I'd mention here is that the medium-term financing, if you decide to go forward with this idea and utilize it, the authorization that we get from the Department of Taxation is good for 18 months. And so that's where the 2006 bonds can come into play. That call date is approximately 2 years from now. And so depending on where interest rates are over the next year and a half, it might make sense to refinance those bonds using this same type of transaction. It doesn't cost us any more to authorize $7 million versus $3 million or $9 million, whatever the number might be. And so it gives us flexibility by authorizing an amount of money under medium-term financing to refinance both issues. We will only issue the amount that we need in order to effect the refunding.
And if I could just maybe mention that when we're talking about authorization, this is authorization by the state tax.
Right, Department of Taxation.
I see the benefits. Is there anything negative to this other than maybe there's excess funds that the board decide they need to spend somewhere?
If the board had available resources to go and pay these off with cash, that certainly would be a better option. But that's a decision, because once you've spent that cash, it's very difficult to get it back. Clearly you've got to build it back up through rates, and that's, rates in the reduced debt service.
But the reserve that we're talking about freeing up would not be available to use by the board. If we do this, it has to flow through to pay off the other bonds, so it's not something that would be available to use for other purposes.
My question is, what's the negative? Is there a negative?
The negatives really are interest rates could go down in the future, in which case we'd be able to save more money. We'd be able to borrow at 1.75 instead of 2.1. But the interesting thing about the refundings are that the savings are generated between the date you can pay off the bonds and the maturity date of the bond. And so as that time period gets shorter, you've got to have a bigger interest rate differential to generate the same amount of savings. So really, unless you believe that interest rates are going to continue to go down, the 5-year range, I've been seeing rates have got to go up for the last 3 years. Someday I will be right. I haven't been yet, but they keep moving around. But that's really, I think, probably the biggest negative.
We've got a question from one of the citizens. Would you please stand up and state your name and where you're from?
Robert Gaskovich, 300 Riverside Road. As I recall, about I used to come to these meetings, and 5 years ago, 4 years ago, the board was really upset about, as I recall, the conversation about, they had talked about issuing bonds, and then they want to cut it back, and the people that were in charge of the bond said you can't take it back, issuing a lower amount than what they had authorized. Do you remember that discussion? And I don't know if this is similar to what he's talking about, or is it something different, but there was a real lot of discussion, and the board was really upset that they had to take all these bonds that they authorized for, and then they didn't need it. I guess you guys weren't going to build a building, you weren't going to do a lot of things, and then they backed off, but they had to issue that amount of bonds. And I don't know if you could explain the difference.
I think we're talking about that 11 million that was defeased.
Right, in the 2008. I don't know if
Go ahead.
Wes, you want me to take a shot at it? My recollection of what happened in that situation is that we authorized And again, I remember what the
It
number
was
was.
23 something.
$23 million worth of bonds. And we had the flexibility to issue whatever amount was wanted up to that amount. At the time the bonds were issued, so the time they were sold, the intent of the district was to proceed with all of the projects that had been discussed. After the bonds were sold, the real estate market changed, projects changed, and those projects were no longer going to be done. And so the bonds had already been issued, and that's really what created the reason for doing the defeasance. Had the bonds not been issued, then nothing would have happened. But it was because the bonds had been sold and closed, the district had the money, that we had to go through that defeasance process.
So I think to answer Mr. Draskovich's question, this is a different process than what that was 5 or 6 years ago.
And as I recall, they weren't allowed to buy them back either, or something like that.
Yeah, we couldn't turn, we said, let's just turn it back. We couldn't do it.
I mean, everybody was really upset about it at the time.
Especially this guy.
And the reason,
Yeah.
and again, that gets back to this discussion about the call date. You can't, once bonds have been issued, you're not in a position to be able to pay them off early or refinance until you hit that date. In this instance, we're talking about, the date is there, it is something we can do, and so it's a totally different
He answered
arrangement.
my question. I just remember there was a lot of discussion, everybody was really upset, and I just didn't know the difference.
Ms. Alliston?
The $475,000 you referenced in the reserve fund, did I hear you, do I understand you to say that that is not available for the board to spend in any other way?
Yeah, it's bond reserve. Those funds are reserve funds, and they're not available. They're held in an account by Wells Fargo, used only for the payment of bonds. If we were to come up short with funds to make bond payments, that's what it would be used for.
Okay,
So that's what that reserve is about at this point in time.
okay.
So the authorization process would be that the board, if they choose to do so, would direct us to move forward with this. If that happens at your next meeting, I guess it would be, we would have a public hearing and you would adopt what we call an authorization resolution. And in advance of that, a notice would be published in the paper for the public hearing. That's part of the statutory requirements. We submit financial information, we submit the resolution, minutes of the public hearing to the Department of Taxation. They approve the financing, your ability to pay it back. Once that happens, it comes back to you to adopt a bond ordinance. At that point in time, we would have bids in hand to refinance the bonds. We'd be able to tell you what the interest rate is, what the savings are, who that winning bidder is. If that gets approved, we spend the next 2 to 3 weeks locking everything up, getting all of the documents done and signed, and then we close. And then you are paying, again, hopefully at a 2% interest rate instead of something closer to 4%.
What's the current interest rate?
3.82 is on the one that we're talking about taking care of right now.
Is there any questions from the board?
I have one quick one on
Sure.
this reserve fund. It's in there only for the bond. Once the bonds are paid off, do we get that money?
Yes, basically, if you let it run its course, I think the last maturity for bonds secured by the reserve fund is 2027.
6 or 7. something like
26 or 27, the state revolving fund bonds. Then typically what is done is the reserve fund money is used to make the last payment. And so instead of you using revenues, alternatively, you could use the revenues, and then since the bonds are gone, that money would then become available to the district to use. But it would have to be used for capital projects since it originally came from bonds.
What's this gonna cost us?
The estimated issuance costs are about $65,000.
I thought I seen that here somewhere.
Yeah, I think it was it's in that comparison, it's like the second to last line, I
That one
believe,
right there.
Mr. Nolan. And again, I mean, that's an estimate, but that should be pretty close
One more back.
to what it is. And those costs are contingent, so I mean, if the deal doesn't happen, you don't have to worry about paying those.
And the other side of that is that.
Oh,
that-
68,000, sorry.
That issuance cost, when we talk about the net savings, reflects that cost having been spent.
Right.
So the savings is after we've paid that, we still are saving $117,000 present value.
Yeah.
You're not getting sales.